that is established to promote human rights and democracy globally online and to protect the internet as a space that nurtures internet freedom. There are a range of activities undertaken by the coalition. There's an annual meeting, which is an information sharing opportunity for governments, but also for civil society and the business community. A very early project was the Digital Defenders Partnership, which Federico will explain to us shortly, which is something that we do to provide support for people in repressive regimes. The coalition produces joint statements, and there are examples of the joint statements available in the room if you're interested. There are a number of working groups that we're going to hear about, which is intersessional work undertaken by the coalition in a multi-stakeholder framework. And there are diplomatic networks established in Paris, in Geneva, and now New York that enable coalition countries to combine and work together to develop a joint approach to particular key internet policy issues that are happening around the world. So that's a quick overview of the coalition. My name's Andrew Puddifat. I'm the director of the support unit. We're an administration unit that supports the work of the coalition. And hence I'll be chairing the meeting today. So maybe if we could start with Frederica and the Digital Defenders Partnership. Could you just give us a flavor of what the partnership does and what its challenges are? Because I think it's one of the projects that's not often associated directly with the Freedom Online Coalition.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me here. So the Digital Defenders Partnership is basically a partnership of 8 of the FOC members, including the US, UK, the Netherlands, Sweden, Estonia, Finland, the Czech Republic, and Latvia. And our main objectives are... Can you hear me well, by the way? It's very strange. Okay.
Okay, you can. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. So our 2 main objectives are firstly to keep critical internet users safe, and secondly to build capacity around emergency response. So from 2012 on, we supported over 10 million critical internet users in 64 countries worldwide, with the help of like software, hardware, physical, legal, or capacity building efforts. Those organizations or individuals we work with range from LGBT activists in Uganda, women's rights activists in Pakistan, human rights defenders in Russia or the Ukraine. And what we do for them is either we provide funding, this could be direct emergency response funding or capacity building funding, or we provide linking and learning activities. We have a whole collaborative partnership with activists on the ground, and we can provide direct links with those. And what we also do is more a long-term sustainable solution on digital safety and security, working with organizations. Besides that, we work with the embassies of our donors. So either they come to us when they have a situation in one of their regions, or we actually train them on internet freedom. Some of the challenges that we have within the program is that regional capacity is really scarce. So we work with a global network of responders, and responders are like tech-savvy people who help whenever there's an emergency in a region. And they actually express the need to have regional responders as well, but those are really scarce. And also within organizations, there's hardly the tech savviness to keep human rights defenders organizations safe. Besides that, what we see is not only digital support is needed, but it's a more holistic approach is needed. So also sometimes it's psychosocial help, sometimes it's more the legal help around it. So not only digital tools are needed. Yeah, I think that's it really briefly.
Thanks very much. One of the features of the last couple of years has been a growth in the intersessional work of the coalition, principally through the establishment of 3 working groups. So we're just going to give you a quick flavour of the work undertaken by those working groups, perhaps starting with Michael Wolmar from Canada, which has been a very active member of Working Group 1 looking at cybersecurity. And one of the products is this very helpful cybersecurity map that mapped out the different policy spaces where cybersecurity issues are being discussed. So, Michael, over to you.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and good morning to everyone here. So, as Andrew said, I'm here to talk about Working Group 1, which was a working group that was established to promote an informed debate on the relationship between governance, security, online freedoms that involves all stakeholders. The goal of the group is to create a human rights frame to cybersecurity discussions and to produce some meaningful outputs that would be helpful to build on existing security policy-making efforts. It's been making great strides since it first met at the IGF last year. There have been 4 primary activities. One has been to try to develop a definition for cybersecurity. The idea was to develop a cybersecurity definition which, unlike many of the traditional definitions of cybersecurity, incorporated a clear commitment to respect for human rights in it. Another activity that the group undertook was recommendations for human rights-based approaches to cybersecurity. The idea being here that we wanted to develop a set of recommendations that promote a greater stakeholder-driven and human rights respecting approaches to cybersecurity. These have been developed to provide guidance to all stakeholders involved in cybersecurity matters, but in particular those who are involved in developing and implementing cybersecurity policies and frameworks. The recommendations are designed to encourage these stakeholders to incorporate the protection and promotion of human rights in all aspects of cybersecurity, and to ensure that cybersecurity policies are designed from the beginning with the human rights in mind. So after several months of work and a number of in-person meetings, we're going to be putting out those recommendations. It's going to be publicly put forward at a workshop tomorrow from 11 to 12:30 p.m. in Working Room 5. Encourage everyone to come out, take a look at those recommendations and having a discussion with us. As Andrew said, another thing that we put together was this cybersecurity mapping exercise. It's available. The idea there is to provide a visual timeline of all that's happening internationally on cybersecurity, and to promote awareness among all stakeholders and to facilitate greater engagement in those discussions. The 2015 map was released at the FOC conference in Mongolia earlier this year, and we're working on a 2016 edition as well. And then finally, there was a series of blogs on the FOC website, which is intended to highlight aspects of our work, call attention to some of the forums and settings where some of this work is going on, and just provide some material of general interest around this issue. There have been blog postings on cybersecurity at the United Nations, the London process, what's happening in the IETF, and the activities of the working group. So just to close on this piece of it, we've been very pleased to participate in this. There have been 3 governments involved in this: Canada, the US, Netherlands, as well as a variety of other stakeholders. And it's been a great pleasure actually to participate. Special thanks to Matthew Shears and Simone Halink of the Netherlands for their leadership. Simone wasn't able to be here today, and I'm substituting for her. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. We'll now move to James Losey from the second working group. One of the features of the working groups, which I think is fairly unusual in our field, is that they are genuinely multi-stakeholder in their policy development. So instead of governments fixing their policy, civil societies fixing their policy, and then meeting and exchanging views, the policy is developed as a partnership. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about the coalition working groups, which are always co-chaired by someone from civil society. And James Losey is the co-chair, along with the government of Sweden, of Working Group 2. So James, just tell us a bit about the working group.
Thank you, Andrew. The goal of Working Group 2 is to focus on digital development and rule of law. So we're able to strengthen existing rule of law principles and good practices, but in a way that will protect and promote human rights online and maximizing the impact of social and economic development. As a group, and as the other working groups, we believe that a multi-stakeholder approach is crucial for the development of internet-related public policies. And our goals just reflect the global, open, and interoperable nature of the internet. We have 2 primary initiatives that we are completing. Number 1, we want to establish rule of law principles and have them adopted by FOC member states at the upcoming Freedom Online Coalition meeting in 2016 in Costa Rica. We also plan to develop a rule of law online good practice document that can be used reflecting the two issue areas that we are focusing on. Number one, data retention and privacy, and number two, freedom of expression online. We believe that this is actually a unique opportunity in our working group because rule of law is at a critical juncture. Rule of law has a decades-long history of development and expertise, but existing institutions do not yet have the technical capacity and aptitude to address issues of the internet online. So we have the opportunity, rather than trying to bring a new breadth of knowledge and expertise to the space we're now, but we're able to leverage the expertise among communities like IGF and the Freedom Online Coalition and bring it to existing institutions of rule of law. Essentially, what we're hoping to do is develop the internet patch for the existing code bases on rule of law expertise and processes. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, James. And finally, for the working groups, I'd like to come to Catherine Kendrick, who's the co-chair of Working Group 3, to tell us a bit about that work. Catherine.
Thanks, Andrew. So Working Group 3 focuses on the relationship between the private sector and governments, and specifically how interactions between the two can have effects on individual privacy and free expression. Our group also met for the first time at the last IGF, and over the last year we've been focusing specifically on transparency about government requests to companies for user information or privacy. In particular, we looked at requests that are made in law enforcement and national security contexts, and how both governments and companies approach decision-making about that process, and also how much to disclose to the public about requests for user information and content restriction. This is an area where there's been a lot of exciting work in the last few years, particularly on company transparency reporting. And for our group, we stepped back and saw the working group as a good forum, particularly with the active involvement of governments, to have conversations with both governments and companies in a Chatham House rule context to really understand their internal decision-making, what challenges they face, what opportunities they see in how much to disclose about this process to the public. So over the last year, we held consultations with companies and governments, a global range, FOC governments, and multinational telecom and internet companies. The results of those research we published last week in a paper that is now on the FOC website. I encourage everyone to take a look. In it, we provide some recommendations to companies and governments looking at this issue about transparency around government requests to companies. And we really see this paper and our research as just a starting point for future work. A big part of our consultations was identifying gaps where the working group and other initiatives in this field might provide more analysis on increasing transparency in this relationship. And so specifically in the coming year, our working group will be focusing on two of the gaps that we identified at the end of the report. One is how to improve, from both governments and companies, transparency about laws, policies, and processes that guide requests for user information. There's been a lot of talk about releasing statistics and understanding the numbers of requests made, and we're interested in focusing on how to better describe the framework of policies and practices that guide companies and governments. And the second area that we're looking at is more generally government transparency reporting, which has been a less developed area than the company side over the last couple years. So in the coming weeks, we'll have more information on specifically what activities we'll do in both those areas. We're excited to partner with the other working groups and also other initiatives in this field. But it's been a great year and an exciting initiative, and so we're looking forward to doing more.
Thanks very much, Catherine. One of the interesting things about the coalition is the chair rotates on an annual basis between different countries, and for the first time the chairpersonship of the coalition now rests in the Americas with the government of Costa Rica. So I'd also like to invite Carla Valdeverde to say a few words about Costa Rica taking over the chair of the coalition and plans for the annual conference next year. Carla.
Good afternoon. My name is Carla Valverde, and I come from the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Telecommunications of Costa Rica. As it was said, we will be hosting the next Freedom Online Coalition meeting in Costa Rica. It will probably be in October or November. We still haven't decided yet because we have to wait and see what happens with IGF Mexico 2016. But for sure, it will be October or November. Right now, we are working on the concept note about the whole meeting. And in this work, there is a group of people involved from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and from the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Telecommunications. So we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carla. The coalition began 2011 as an annual meeting of 12 countries. It's now 28 and growing because more countries are applying. So the kind of infrastructure that supports the coalition is being considered, the mandate of the coalition, the working processes. And part of that is a review that's being instituted by the coalition. Maybe I could ask Gigi Alford just to conclude the panel sessions by telling us a bit about the evaluation and how it's developing.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. In 2015, earlier this year in May, the annual conference was held in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And there, the Freedom Online Coalition announced that it would be undertaking a 5-year strategic review, as Andrew said, with the plan to reflect on the development over the first 5 years, and then conceivably to inform a strategic plan for the next 5 years of its existence, but with all of the considerations that Andrew mentioned. The UK and the US are co-chairing a working group to conduct the strategic review. And to shepherd this process, they are definitely informed by the recognition that the FOC really has grown over these past 5 years. I mean, in some ways it's more than doubled, and its activities have more than tripled when you consider the fact that there are now these 3 working groups. You have the local chapters that are operating, the joint statements have been multiplying, and so how to sustain this going forward with an understanding of the coalition's value add. So the working group designed a framework that has both an internal component and an external component. The idea being that there would be a member-driven stock-taking exercise to understand internally what are the value add of the coalition, but then also working with an external researcher, an independent researcher, Susan Morgan, who happens to be here, and I understand that later will be commenting a little bit about her part of the review, which she's here at the IGF working towards very assiduously. So I'll let her talk about that a little bit more, but briefly, the kind of overall aims is to work with the expected timeline of delivering the final assessment of the review at the Freedom Online Conference in Costa Rica in late fall next year, and hopefully at that time also having some plans to announce about the strategic plan moving forward. But I think this will definitely depend on the outcome, the results of the external assessment, and then the internal review that will follow that. I think one thing to note about the driving factor for the external assessment is the desire to elicit the views and concerns of the external community, as these are really important for the member states of the coalition to hear, so that they can be mindful of those concerns and work with it, because this was a major purpose of the coalition, and assessing how that purpose has been followed and whether or not there needs to be any refinement going forward. It's very important to hear the external viewpoints. Susan will talk about this a little bit more, but the 4 key areas that we're looking at include FOC membership, the internal structure of the organization, the funding structure to support all of this, and of course the activities that then follow. And all of this is under the umbrella of the mandate of the coalition, which will be reviewed and then decided going forward in this consultative manner. I think this systematic exercise to document the various views and concerns, including, if not especially, critical ones, shows a concern about prioritizing the activities, as there is much to be done, but obviously limited resources and capacities. And so this is something that the coalition members will take back from the external assessment and consider together. The external assessment, which Susan, maybe you can go into right now, I think will be the indispensable roadmap for guiding the direction of the review as it looks at the concerns it needs to address and the kind of feasibility within that scope. Thanks, Judge.
Thanks, Gigi. I will come straight to Susan just to say a few words about the review, following up on that.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Gosh, it's hard to hear. So just a few words about the review. So I'm working with the University of Pennsylvania, and the outcome of the strategic review will be a public report published via UPenn. The work will be completed probably in about 6 months' time. As Gigi mentioned, there'll be 4 components to the research that I'm carrying out. I'm looking at the membership of the coalition, the focus of the coalition's activities and which are most important if we need to prioritize, looking at the structure and the internal governance of the coalition, given that when it started 5 years ago there were 11 members, there's now 28. So in terms of kind of the organizational development, you know, are there things that we need to be thinking about differently? And then finally looking at the funding model and whether the coalition has sufficient funds for its mandate, and if not, how do we address the gap? In terms of the methodology, I'm interviewing 30 people on a one-to-one basis in 1-hour interviews. That's both members of the governments who are in the coalition, members of the working parties, and then also people who aren't members of the coalition or involved in any way. So we also want to get some perspective and some insight from people who have chosen not to be involved at this stage in the coalition's work. I also held a consultation a couple of days ago here with about 15 or 16 people taking part, and if anyone would like to contribute to the review, then I'm not quite sure what the mechanism is for that. Maybe if Gigi, if people can get in touch with you and then you can direct them to me. Okay, cheers.
Thanks very much, Susan. We do have other governments present, the governments of Norway, Estonia, Netherlands and Germany. So they also may want to contribute in the course of the discussion. I'll leave that up to them. But now really it's an open forum. We're very keen to have your views, your contributions, your thoughts on the kind of work the coalition could do, how we can work better as partners with you all, and any other thoughts you may have about the coalition's overall direction or structure. So please feel free to come in, make contributions now. This is your platform, your time. Stunned silence. We've overawed you with the sheer volume of work and intelligence pouring from the panel. I like that. So nobody, you're all too intimidated. So, okay, I'm going to actually come. Oh, excellent.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you for breaking the ice. Perhaps this will help. I'm Ricardo Amor. I'm the Ambassador at Large for Cybersecurity of Spain, and I'm representing the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would like to take the advantage first to say thank you to the speakers, and in particular for the information given concerning the work of the 3 different working groups. Obviously there is a lot of information also in the web page, and I think that they have included additional data that are of interest in this forum. Since I do not have much to contribute because I am a newcomer, and actually I just wanted to say that Spain is ready to join this group in the coming months, and we would like to express also our commitment concerning the basic principles and goals that the FOC has in its endeavor. So having said that, I think that if there are other representatives of other governments in this room that would like to join, I would like to encourage them to do so. And I think that the procedure is quite easy, because actually we have simply to subscribe the principles and the documents, the basic documents of the forum, and waiting for the green light for the other present 28 members that you have already in this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. We're really looking forward to Spain joining the coalition and working with you in the months to come. So are there any other contributions? Okay, I might come back to Catherine. Just put a question to you. Catherine, you've actually sat in government as well as now outside in civil society, and the working groups operate as a multi-stakeholder process rather than just as a government process. Can you tell us a bit what you think the strengths and advantages of that multi-stakeholder process have been, given your background and history in a sense, both sides of the argument?
Thank you. I think there are quite a few strengths to having a multilateral piece to the coalition and then having the multi-stakeholder working groups. Specifically for the working groups, the idea was to get to a more concrete level, looking at issues of concerns to governments and other stakeholders and producing concrete products, extending from the general principles that FOC governments have ascribed to and that the field has sort of developed over the last couple years. And speaking from the perspective of our group and knowing participants on the other group, we've just brought together a really amazing group of experts in this field, and we've had the opportunity to meet with coalition governments in different forums, both through our consultations and elsewhere, and have that knowledge sharing from civil society and private sector representatives that the working group provided an avenue for. So I think just being able to have that forum for that interaction is really valuable, particularly for governments who may not always interact with other stakeholders. So that's been a big benefit of the multi-stakeholder working groups, and I think we've generally found it to be a productive forum and something for the coalition to increase in the coming year.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to come now to Matthew Shears, who's the co-chair of the cybersecurity working group. Matthew, I want to ask you, cybersecurity is one of those issues that traditionally in government terms is dominated by security and intelligence apparatuses, and there's very little opportunity for civil society to be involved. Can you just share a bit with us your experience of trying to craft a human rights cybersecurity policy in a multi-stakeholder environment, which I think is a fairly unique challenge?
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I apologize for not being here earlier on. I'm sure Michael covered the work of the working group. But the real interesting aspect of this is that, as Andrew said, we're addressing issues where there is a significant divergence of opinion. In cybersecurity, it's well known that certain stakeholders may not see eye to eye. And the real challenge that we had was coming up with a set of recommendations that we're going to be unveiling tomorrow morning, where everyone could find something in there that they were comfortable living with, but at the same time we were pushing each other. The various stakeholder representatives in the working group were pushing to get a little bit more than we might. Getting that meeting of minds was an incredibly rewarding and at times tortuous process. But I think what we've got now is actually a product that we can be proud of, and hopefully you'll agree with that when we unveil them tomorrow. But that working together as stakeholders has been and coming together on difficult issues, I think, has been a real value of the Working Group 1.
Thanks very much. I want to come to a separate topic now, the diplomatic coordination. I'm coming to Piret, our colleague from Estonia. As I said at the beginning, one of the things the coalition does is it meets within different forums. UNESCO, for example, there's a large coalition group that made a major input into the Connecting the Dots conference. In Geneva, the coalition countries have coordinated around the work of the Human Rights Council, and there have been recent meetings of New York which begin to look at the various New York processes. And Piret, you were very instrumental in putting together the Geneva network. Can you just tell us what the challenges were of trying to pull a diplomatic network beyond the traditional geopolitical boundaries, and just share that a bit with the participants?
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. I'm very happy to see everybody here. As you know, Estonia has been quite active earlier in the Freedom Online Coalition. As I was posted to Geneva myself earlier, I knew a bit dynamics there, and our interest was that Freedom Online Coalition wouldn't be based only on the colleagues of the capitals, but also there would be network in Paris, in Geneva, in New York, all the multilateral places. So we were trying to bring added value in Geneva as a coalition, and I think we quite did it. We made a few joint statements there. We had some meetings, and we tried to connect all the governments really, who are not always present in the big events in different reasons. Also in Geneva, we communicated a lot with the civil society. They could bring their added value being in Geneva, and there is the opportunity. In Geneva, there's a very good opportunity because there are many civil society representatives who are also part of this field, like internet freedom field and the human rights, because Geneva is a kind of capital of human rights, as we all know. So and this is what the coalition is doing, more or less. It's like human rights in the internet. So I hope everything continues there, and the coalition grows stronger also in multilateral fora, not only like once a year, or not only like in IGF meetings, but more and more there is everyday work in different capitals, and this is how it becomes stronger, and this is how the coalition can bring something additional to the international organizations as well, and to cooperate more intensively with the NGOs and also the big companies, the businesses who are interested in. And also we can't forget academia representatives. They have been also involved quite a lot, and they are interested, and we are very happy that they are interested. There have been the people from Morocco and many other universities all over the world who have been involved in our work. So thank you. I don't know if you have any other questions, Andrea. Thanks.
I mean, obviously, I have a question here.
Well, comment, question. Okay, since we have all these states here, and you're mentioning civil society, and I heard a lot about involvement, etc., but in what? Do you think that civil society should continue to legitimize the Freedom Online Coalition when you could validly argue that the member states of the Freedom Online Coalition are undermining freedom online through their opposition to encryption, through mass surveillance processes, and through their lack of leadership, and yet still trying to have this forum called the Freedom Online Coalition? So you have Morocco today, which has just arrested several activists and journalists working for Privacy International and other groups. You know, you have the governments that are supposed to be leading by example, leading in the wrong direction. So can you tell us why civil society should continue to legitimize this coalition, and if you plan to live up to your values?
Did you want to say who you are?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Courtney Raj with the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, I mean, Morocco is not a member of the Freedom Online Coalition, so on that one, I think the coalition can plead innocent. I don't know if any of the governments want to respond to that. It's a question that comes up, I think, fairly regularly about, if you like, the internal character of the coalition. Maybe, Gigi, I could start with you and then see if other governments want to come in. I'll come back to Michael as well.
Sure. You know, please do add, because as we know here, I'm certainly not the right person to comment on, you know, policies and activities of all the FOC member states, and probably not specifically on my own government, but I do know to this question of, you know, why civil society should continue to engage. I think we have seen over the past 3 years a lot of efforts on behalf of the FOC as a coalition and on behalf of the individual member states to address the precise concerns that you've raised. They've affected the priorities of the FOC, from promoting a free, open, and global internet to the perceived standing of the individual countries as promoters and champions of internet freedom. And there are efforts going on to address that, even as there are other efforts that demonstrate the complexity of any government, and stuff that we're watching closely, and specifically trying to address them. I think, you know, with the 3 working groups that are on this panel right now, they're a testament to specific changes of course to try to engage civil society more in addressing the issues. And if you look at the topics of the 3 working groups, if you look at the experts that have been, you know, that applied and were selected to participate, it shows a rich conversation that creates a feedback loop. and something that I think we can see, watching the news, seeing the developments in terms of new legislation that's been introduced, new decisions that have been made, for example, in the U.S., not to pursue an option for backdoors and encryption. I mean, this is the type of conversation that these types of working groups are trying to inform. And I think the direct engagement that Catherine was talking about is an example of how that can be done constructively. And not necessarily always easy to talk about very publicly, but something that informs the internal conversations of the coalition and then back when the governments go and talk with their agencies.
Michael?
Thank you. I guess I would sort of start off by saying that I think what we're trying to embark upon here is not a process of legitimization, but rather engagement. I think what we would like to do is engage with civil society on these range of issues and have these open discussions so that we can continue to make progress in this area. I think that the issue is not so much one of whether we are legitimizing anyone's activities or not, but rather what can we do together to make progress on this range of issues. Certainly with respect to where we stand on particular issues, there is the basis of the work of the group that was adopted in Tallinn, which lays out the principles on which we all operate. And as our colleague from Spain said, you must subscribe to these principles in order to be able to join. I would add that these are very real and very relevant discussions in which we're committed to engaging. There is going to be a session tomorrow where we talk through some of these principles. We do have this working group on the relationship between governance, security, and freedom, which is to involve all stakeholders. So, it's not like we're trying to avoid this discussion. We want to have this discussion. On the issue of, what's happening out there in the world, I would say that I don't want to lose sight of the fact that while we do need to hold ourselves as democratic and law-abiding countries to a higher standard, perhaps, I don't think that we want to allow us to lose sight of the broader issues of respect for human rights online internationally. There are a lot of countries out there that are up to some activities that are pretty questionable, and I would hate to think that there are others that are out there that there are people who are suffering each day, bloggers who are being imprisoned, journalists who are being attacked, while we focus our attention on ourselves and forget about their plight as well. So, and just one final point, there's been I think there's generally understood to be a lot of tension, perhaps, between human rights and security. But it's our position that they are, in fact, mutually reinforcing. As all of us go about our lives, our digital lives, as we interact with one another, as we promote our views online, we all have a stake in ensuring that we are secure as we do so. So there is, I think, perhaps a tension. There needs to be a discussion. But in our view, you can't have human rights without security, and you can't have security without human rights. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Maybe I could just say, Courtney, why, as a civil society activist, I'm actually quite comfortable working with the coalition, because it's the governments can answer that question, but it's important for us to answer that question too. I mean, for me, governments are all coalitions. They represent, as you know, if you have any kind of analysis of a government, you know that there are trade interests, security interests, political interests, geopolitical interests, and sometimes human rights interests. And in many governments, those human rights interests are very weak, or maybe in many cases don't exist at all, as we see in many countries of the world. So I think what you have with the coalition is a network connecting those bits of government which are keen to promote democracy and human rights. And within the overall architecture of the internet policy world, this is the only bit of government that is seeking to actively promote a human rights approach to internet policy and internet development. And for me, that means it's worth engaging with, supporting and trying to strengthen and bolstering in their internal discussions with other aspects of government. Because if we were to walk away from it and say, no point in engaging with the Freedom Online Coalition because the governments themselves, in our opinion, are not pure, then we would leave the interaction between states to that dominated by economic, security and trade interests. And we would lose the very valuable infrastructure that we're beginning to develop, which is an exchange on a human rights basis between governments. So for me, that makes it a very valuable lever, an opportunity for us to begin to engage with governments who, in the end of the day, are the decision makers when it comes to all the key decisions affecting human rights. And without government, we can't actually have a serious commitment to human rights. So for us, that's how we see it. We see it as a piece of the architecture globally that it's important for us to engage with as civil society. And we can look at the work of the working groups and see that when there is serious engaged discussion, some real progress is made in developing standards and practices that I think can be rolled out more generally, not just across the coalition, but act as an example to the rest of the world. So, and the interest of governments in joining the coalition is a factor that we're noting with increasing interest, that more and more people want to be associated with it. So I think there's some kind of interesting arguments there, and I'll come to Frederica and then Carla.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I really would like to second what you're saying, actually, and I love how you explain it, seeing a government as a coalition. And also I wanted to say, like, I'm a civil society representative, and I mean, we're funded by a few of the FRC members, and we're able to do this incredible work with human rights defenders on the ground. So yeah, that's really incredible as well, and possible thanks to this coalition.
Thanks. Carla?
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to share with you what's the experience in Costa Rica. For instance, when we come to IGF, the position of the country is not defined by the government. It's defined in the Internet Governance Council of Costa Rica. And there we have the public sector, the private sector, we also have academia, and we have civil society. So we come all together and we start discussing several points. And after the meeting, we create or we identify key ideas. For instance, this year, I'm just going to tell them quickly. There were 4 key ideas that are the position of Costa Rica. The first one is to support a multi-stakeholder model. We believe internet belongs to everyone. We must all participate in the debate on the rules that should govern it. The internet governance model should be based on a multi-stakeholder approach, regardless of our political, corporate, or financial power. The second one is to support a free and open internet, and legitimate concerns in the areas of privacy, security, and intellectual property protection should not be an excuse to justify actions to pursue highly restrictive controls on cyberspace, and there must not be barriers to universal internet access. Third, to support a model that ensures privacy and security. We advocate for a model that ensures privacy and security within universal access schemes. In the safety area, priority must be children's safety. And finally, support universally accepted principles. Support universally accepted principles such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the basis for a good internet governance and protection of users' rights to govern this new space that opens to humanity, the cyberspace. So then we work all together to come with this Costa Rican position. And, well, I just wanted to share that with you.
Thanks, Carla. Frederica.
One more thing I forgot, maybe to say to Susan, maybe it's good to have a look if there is a need for an internal watchdog somehow, and how that could work.
Thanks. Michael, can I come back to you with a question? Because you raised the broader spectrum that coalition faces across the world. And we're seeing the Freedom of the Net report suggests that internet freedom has declined again over about 5 years. So we're seeing a downward trend. We're seeing, Courtney reminded us about the situation in Morocco. A lot of us are engaged in the situation in Turkey, where journalists and bloggers are being arrested and social media platforms taken down. We're involved in a lot of work in Bangladesh, where bloggers are being killed and where the government is at the very least not taking the action it could take to protect people who operate as secular, as try to operate with secular points of view. Should the coalition be doing more to project and drive internet freedom globally? Are there more things the coalition could and should be doing to focus attention on those parts of the world where really internet freedom doesn't exist in any form whatsoever?
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think when you look to see what the basis of the coalition is, why it was founded, and the direction that it took from the beginning, I think, you will see that that is in fact what the Freedom Online Coalition is about. It is about promoting the cause of freedom online internationally. So then I guess the question then is well, what more could we be doing internationally in some of the places that you're talking about? That is something that we've been discussing internally within the coalition. You made mention of some of the work that we have done with respect to organizing ourselves in certain places around the world to be able to intervene. And for example, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and the General Assembly, the work with the General Assembly, the OECD, the UNESCO in Paris. So we are trying to band together to bring a like-minded, a common approach to some of these questions internationally. We're also comparing notes amongst ourselves, what we can do to strengthen organizations around the world like HEVOS and others to be able to help them to continue to do their work. I guess what we have as well is strength in numbers, being able to bring the weight of attention to certain circumstances, to situations that arise around the world. And we try to do that. But as anyone who's worked in a bureaucracy will tell you, it isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do to coordinate a large number of people, but we are committed to finding ways to work together better and to be able to react more quickly to the kind of situations that you see arising around the world. But you're absolutely right. The trend internationally is negative, and it's really going to be through the work of groups like the Freedom Online Coalition, like civil society, human rights defenders, wherever they're found, to be able to try and reverse that trend. We've got to work together on that. Thanks.
James, yeah.
Absolutely agree. I think there's an opportunity to work together, but I want to put a request out to the governments participating in the Freedom Online Coalition. From an advocacy perspective, the impulse is always to talk to the face you know and the people you have access to. And because governments are coalitions and complicated bureaucracies in and of themselves, that might not always be the best point of our advocacy. If we want to comment on domestic issues from an advocacy perspective, the foreign ministries aren't the best people to receive that information. I think there's an opportunity for the government participants and members of the Freedom Online Coalition to work with us through these meetings to let us know what are the unique processes in your country, who are the people we could be talking to, and where else can we be coordinating our advocacy. If you want to be advocates for internet freedom from a government perspective, you can work with the advocates within civil society to help us direct our strategic resources and who we can be talking to within your governments to work together to decrease this negative trend.
So, Jason Pielmeyer from the State Department, and just wanted to pick up on James's point, which I think is a good one, and it's sort of part of a theme in the conversation about governments as internally as coalitions. I think we have been able to start doing that through some of the working group work. Working Group 3 in particular held consultations with a number of different FOC governments, some of whom are participating in Working Group 3 and others who are not. And at least in some of those cases, the conversation was facilitated by people like myself who engage with the coalition directly on a regular basis, but the actual conversation included people from our Justice Department, FBI, and Office of Director of National Intelligence. And so we had the kind of operational people, James, that I think you're identifying as often appropriate for these conversations. And in that case, it was a conversation about transparency related to requests for user information. So that conversation is happening. I think there's some at least examples of how the working groups have been able to facilitate that. And I think that's important that we build on that. It's a lot of work. It's challenging as the person kind of as the go-between. I don't want to necessarily overpromise because it's not easy to do. But I think that's going back to the broader question that Courtney brought up about the value of the coalition. I think actually, at least from my perspective, and I think others who've been in other governments maybe will second this. It's really been useful to use the coalition to talk to other parts of our own government and remind them about these commitments that we have made as a government, and help them and us collectively articulate how it is that we see ourselves living up to those things. And so it's perhaps not as confrontational or as direct and public as some would like to see, but those conversations are happening because of the coalition. And if not for the coalition, it's hard for me to see how exactly those conversations would be happening, or if they would be happening in quite as structured and robust and multilateral way. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And then just one last point to Courtney's question about holding the governments accountable. It isn't part of the charter of the FOC to do that within its own membership. Certainly we hear often about the need for that. And one thing I would just say is that one thing I have seen happen is people in civil society from some of the countries that are involved use the fact that the countries are engaged as a way to pressure their own governments domestically and say, look, you've signed up to these principles, and now maybe you're passing this legislation, or you've implemented this policy, or you've taken this specific action. Explain to me how that's consistent with this. If they were not members of the FOC, you wouldn't necessarily have that leverage or that opportunity to link those specific commitments, which are more specific and more applied to the online context than the general UDHR principles. So we'd certainly like to foster more of that, and we see the coalition and the Tallinn principles in particular as perhaps helping to foster more of those conversations. We also hear from civil society activists in countries who are not members of the coalition that they would like us to convince those countries to join or conduct outreach to those countries, I think for that reason, so that they can then use that leverage in a domestic conversation. So anyway, that's a lot of food for thought, but just thought I'd chime in. Thanks
very much. We are actually out of time because it's 1 o'clock and we started a bit late, and it's been wonderful being with you in this aircraft hangar. So I do hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and can you thank the panel in the traditional way for their contributions? Thank you. So let's get some lunch.